Content warning. This episode discusses real historical events involving multiple deaths across 3 generations. We present this story with respect for those who suffered and their descendants. Viewer discretion is advised. Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing genealogical mysteries in American history. Tell us where you're watching from now, because this story will haunt you in a way few other accounts can. Not through spectacular violence or sensational headlines, but through the quiet, relentless accumulation of deaths that defied explanation for nearly 70 years. We're about to delve into a mystery that consumed 3 generations of the Whitlock family in the mountains of eastern Kentucky, where death arrived with such methodical precision that entire branches of a family tree withered and died before bearing fruit, leaving a legacy so dark and so statistically impossible that modern forensic experts still debate what really happened in those isolated hollows between 1889 and 1956. It was the year 1889. While the Eiffel Tower was rising in Paris and electric lights were illuminating the streets of major cities, much of rural Appalachia remained untouched by the industrial age. In Harlan County, Kentucky, tucked between ridges so steep that sunlight touched the valley floors for only a few hours each day, the situation was even more remote. Here, families lived as their ancestors had for generations, farming narrow creek bottoms, hunting the forested slopes, and passing down traditions that stretched back to Scotland and Ireland. The mountains of eastern Kentucky are not like other ranges in America. The Appalachians here are ancient, worn down by time into a maze of narrow valleys called hollows, pronounced hollers by those who live within them. These are not the dramatic peaks of the Rockies or the gentle slopes of the Smokies. These are meagy ridges that fold into one another like wrinkled cloth, creating pockets of isolation where communities develop their own dialects, their own customs, their own ways of understanding the world. In the 1880s, reaching Harlan County required days of difficult travel. The railroad wouldn't arrive until 1911, and even then, it would follow only the main valleys. The hollows themselves, places like Clover Fork, Catron's Creek, and Martin's Fork, remained accessible only by footpaths and wagon trails that became impassable during the winter months. It was in one of these places, a hollow so narrow and remote it didn't appear on maps until the 1920s, that the Whitlock family made their home. The hollow had no official name. Locals called it Whitlock Branch, after the family that had settled there in 1847. When Thomas Whitlock and his wife Mary brought their 4 children across the mountains from Virginia, seeking cheaper land and the isolation that distance provides. By 1889, 3 generations of Whitlocks had been born in that hollow. They farmed a few dozen acres of bottomland along the creek, kept livestock on the slopes, and lived in a collection of cabins clustered where the branch forked. The family had grown to nearly 40 members by that year. Thomas had died in 1882, but his sons and grandsons had stayed, building homes near the original cabin, creating a small compound of blood relations. This was common in Appalachia, family clusters that functioned almost as small villages, self-sufficient and insular. The Whitlocks were known in the county seat at Harlan as hard-working, deeply religious, and fiercely private. They were also known for something else, though people spoke of it only in whispers. The Whitlocks didn't live long. It started with Sarah. Sarah Whitlock was the daughter of Thomas's eldest son, James. Born in 1870, she was by all accounts a healthy, vibrant young woman. She had dark hair, her father's gray eyes, and a laugh that reportedly echoed through the hollow. In the spring of 1889, at 19 years old, Sarah complained of headaches. Within 3 weeks, she was dead. The doctor who traveled to the hollow, a circuit physician who served several remote communities, could offer no clear diagnosis. Sarah had suffered from severe headaches, confusion, seizures, and finally a coma from which she never woke. Brain fever, the doctor wrote in his notes, a catch-all term used when the cause of death remained mysterious. He collected his modest fee and rode back to Harlan, thinking little more of it. 6 weeks later, Sarah's younger brother, 15-year-old Thomas Jr., died of the same symptoms: headaches, confusion, seizures, death. The progression was identical. The family was devastated but not yet alarmed. Illness was common in the mountains. Typhoid, tuberculosis, scarlet fever, all swept through communities with terrible regularity. 2 siblings dying weeks apart was tragic but not unprecedented. Then Sarah's father, James, began complaining of headaches. James Whitlock was 43 years old and had never been seriously ill. He worked his farm, hunted the ridges, and led prayers at the family's Sunday gatherings. When the headaches started in August of 1889, his wife Hannah tried the usual remedies: willow bark tea, cold compresses, rest. Nothing helped. Within 2 weeks, James experienced his first seizure. A month later, he was dead. 3 members of the immediate family gone in 4 months. This was when people began to notice. The doctor returned, this time more concerned. He examined the surviving family members and found them healthy. He inspected the cabin where James, Sarah, and Thomas Jr. had lived, looking for environmental causes: bad water, contaminated food, toxic fumes from an improperly vented stove. He found nothing alarming. The cabin was poor but clean. The well water was clear. The food stores appeared normal. It must be bad blood, he concluded finally, using another term common in that era for hereditary illness. Sometimes entire families carry weaknesses that express themselves suddenly. I've seen it before. Families prone to consumption, to dropsy, to fits. The Whitlock line may carry something similar. This diagnosis satisfied no one, but what else could be said? The family buried their dead in the small cemetery on the hillside above the hollow and tried to move forward. Hannah Whitlock, now a widow with 3 surviving children, moved in with her brother-in-law's family. For 2 years, there were no more deaths. Life in the hollow returned to its rhythms: planting and harvesting, hunting and preserving, the slow cycle of mountain subsistence. People almost forgot about the cluster of deaths in 1889. Almost. In the spring of 1892, Hannah's eldest surviving son, 17-year-old Matthew, began complaining of headaches. The pattern was repeating. Identical symptoms, identical progression. Matthew fought the illness for 6 weeks, but on a humid June morning, he died in the same manner as his siblings and father before him. His mother Hannah, consumed by grief and now convinced that some curse or contamination afflicted her immediate family, made a desperate decision. She took her 2 remaining children, 14-year-old Rebecca and 11-year-old Jonathan, and left the hollow. She moved them to a farm 7 miles away, near the community of Evarts, where a cousin had offered them shelter. If it was something in the hollow causing these deaths, something in the water, the soil, the very air, distance might save her remaining children. It didn't. Rebecca died in September of 1892. Jonathan followed in November. Hannah, having lost her entire family in just over 3 years, survived only a few months longer. The doctor who attended her at the end said she died of a broken heart, though the official cause listed was pneumonia. Some griefs he noted in his journal are simply too heavy to bear. By the end of 1893, James Whitlock's entire immediate family, his wife and all 5 of their children, were dead. The Whitlock family in the hollow was devastated, but they were also numerous. James had been one of 4 brothers, and while his line had been erased, the others remained. There were still Whitlocks farming that narrow valley, still children being born into the family name. Life continued, but the deaths continued too. Between 1893 and 1900, 7 more Whitlocks died of the same mysterious affliction. The pattern was consistent and terrifying: headaches, confusion, seizures, death. The victims ranged in age from 12 to 48. Some died quickly, within weeks of the first symptoms. Others lingered for months, their minds deteriorating before their bodies finally gave out. Doctors who examined the family began to notice something strange. The illness seemed to affect only direct descendants of Thomas Whitlock, the original settler. Those who had married into the family remained healthy. Women born as Whitlocks but who had married and taken other names also seemed immune, as did their children. But anyone carrying the Whitlock name through the male line appeared vulnerable. This observation led to the first serious medical inquiry into the deaths. In 1901, Dr. Edmund Prescott, a physician who had recently moved to Harlan from Louisville, became intrigued by the case. Dr. Prescott had been trained in the new scientific medicine emerging from Europe and was familiar with the work of researchers studying hereditary diseases. He requested permission from the family to conduct a thorough investigation. The Whitlocks, desperate for answers, agreed. Dr. Prescott spent 3 months in the hollow during the summer of 1901. He interviewed surviving family members, examined medical records such as they existed, and reviewed the pattern of deaths. He tested the water from multiple wells, analyzed soil samples from the farms, and even examined the limestone rocks that formed the hollow's foundations, wondering if some mineral contamination might be leaching into the groundwater. His findings, published in a Louisville medical journal in 1902, were both detailed and deeply unsatisfying. Dr. Prescott confirmed that the deaths followed a hereditary pattern consistent with what we now call an autosomal dominant genetic disorder, meaning that a single copy of a mutated gene could cause the disease, and each child of an affected parent had a 50% chance of inheriting it. However, he could identify no specific mechanism for the illness. The symptoms suggested a neurological condition, possibly affecting the brain's structure or chemistry, but without modern diagnostic tools. He could go no further. The Whitlock family, he wrote, appears to suffer from a hereditary affliction of the nervous system, the precise nature of which remains unknown to current medical science. The condition manifests in late childhood through middle age and progresses rapidly once symptoms appear. There is no known treatment. Families carrying this burden must understand that approximately half of each generation will likely be affected. This prognosis was devastating. It meant that the deaths would continue, generation after generation, claiming roughly half of each Whitlock born. It meant that parents would watch their children for signs of the curse, wondering which ones would be spared and which would fall victim. It meant that young Whitlocks contemplating marriage had to consider whether they should have children at all, knowing they might pass this death sentence to their offspring. Some chose not to marry. Others left the hollow, changing their names, hoping distance and anonymity might somehow break the pattern. But many stayed. This was their home, their land, their identity. The Whitlocks had lived in that hollow for 50 years. They weren't going to be driven out by an illness they didn't understand. The second generation of the curse, roughly 1900 to 1930, brought both new horrors and new attention. As the 20th century progressed and Harlan County became less isolated, the Whitlock deaths began to attract outside notice. Newspapers in Lexington and Louisville occasionally ran stories about the cursed family in the mountains. Medical students at the University of Kentucky discussed the case in classes on hereditary disease. In 1923, a researcher from Johns Hopkins Hospital traveled to Kentucky hoping to study the family. But the Whitlocks, weary of examination and increasingly suspicious of outsiders, refused to cooperate. By then, the pattern had become even clearer and more devastating. Of the 32 Whitlocks born between 1895 and 1915, 18 had died of the family illness by 1930. The deaths continued to follow the same pattern: neurological symptoms beginning with headaches, progressing to seizures and cognitive decline, ending in death usually within 3 to 6 months of the first symptoms. But something new emerged during this period: documentation. One member of the family, a man named Samuel Whitlock, born in 1898, had received an education unusual for that time and place. He had attended a small college in Barberville and worked as a school teacher in the county. Samuel was obsessed with understanding the curse that had killed his father, 2 of his siblings, and countless cousins. He began keeping meticulous records, a family chronicle that documented every death, every symptom, every detail he could gather from surviving relatives. Samuel's chronicle, which eventually filled 3 leather-bound ledgers, provides the most complete picture we have of the family's suffering during those years. His entries are clinical, but occasionally reveal deep emotion. March 14, 1921. My sister Elizabeth complained today of pain behind her eyes. She is 22 years old. I know what comes next. I have seen it too many times. There is nothing I can do but watch and wait and record, hoping that someday someone will read these pages and understand what we could not. Elizabeth died on May 3, 1921, 7 weeks after that entry. Samuel himself would die of the family illness in 1934 at age 36. But before he did, he made copies of his chronicles and sent them to medical schools and research institutions across the country. He wrote desperate letters to neurologists, geneticists, and any scientist he thought might help. Most never responded. A few sent polite letters expressing interest but explaining they lacked the tools to investigate further. One response came from Dr. Margaret Hartwell, a neurologist at Massachusetts General Hospital in Boston. Dr. Hartwell had been studying a group of diseases called neurodegenerative disorders, conditions where brain cells progressively die, leading to cognitive and motor decline. She believed the Whitlock curse might be an early-onset form of what we now recognize as a hereditary neurodegenerative disease. In 1929, Dr. Hartwell traveled to Kentucky. Unlike previous researchers, she came not to study the family as curiosities, but to genuinely try to help. She spent 2 months in the Hollow, examining affected family members, reviewing Samuel's chronicles, and conducting what tests were available at the time. What she discovered would change how we understand the case. Dr. Hartwell's examination of living patients revealed something previous doctors had missed. The seizures weren't random. They followed a specific pattern, always beginning in the same part of the brain, as evidenced by how they presented, starting with a particular type of muscle spasm, spreading in a predictable sequence. This suggested a structural problem in a specific region of the brain. More importantly, she noticed something in the family history that had been overlooked. The illness affected both men and women, but it seemed to have a higher mortality rate in males. Of the documented deaths, roughly 60% were males, despite births being relatively evenly split between genders. This detail suggested that perhaps there were 2 factors at play: the primary disease and possibly something else, hormonal, environmental, or related to a second genetic factor that influenced severity. Dr. Hartwell wrote in her report, "The Whitlock family suffers from what I believe to be a hereditary progressive neurological disorder affecting the cerebral cortex. The disease appears to be dominant, requiring only 1 copy of the affected gene to manifest. However, the variable expressivity, the fact that some individuals show symptoms early while others develop them later, and that severity differs, suggests complex genetic interactions we do not yet understand." She collected blood samples from willing family members and tissue samples from those who had recently died and whose families agreed to limited autopsies. These samples were sent back to Boston, where they were preserved. At the time, the technology didn't exist to analyze them meaningfully. DNA wouldn't be identified as the carrier of genetic information for another 2 decades. Dr. Hartwell could only hope that someday, future scientists with better tools might find answers in those preserved tissues. Before Dr. Hartwell left Kentucky, she sat with Samuel Whitlock in his small cabin and told him the truth as she understood it. "This is genetic," she said. "It's written into the very fabric of your family's heredity. It likely arose from a spontaneous mutation in one of your ancestors, probably Thomas, the founder, or possibly in one of his parents. That mutation has been passed down, generation to generation, killing approximately half of those who inherit it. Can it be cured?" Samuel asked. Dr. Hartwell shook her head. "Not in our lifetime. Perhaps not in your grandchildren's lifetime. But medicine advances. Someday, perhaps, we will understand the human body well enough to intervene." Samuel closed his eyes. "So we just endure." "You endure," Dr. Hartwell agreed. "And you document. Your chronicles matter, Samuel. They may help future generations understand what happened here." After Dr. Hartwell's visit, something shifted in the family's approach to their curse. Armed with the knowledge that this was genetic and hereditary, some younger Whitlocks made the difficult decision not to have children. Others chose to leave the Hollow entirely, hoping that if they scattered, if they integrated into other communities and other families, the curse might dilute into the larger population and eventually disappear. But many stayed. The Hollow was home. The land was theirs. And there was something else, something harder to articulate: pride. The Whitlocks had endured this curse for 2 generations. They had buried their dead, mourned their losses, and continued. They weren't going to surrender now. The 3rd generation of the curse, roughly 1930 to 1956, would be the last, but not because the family line ended. It ended because science finally caught up. The 1930s and 1940s brought devastating losses to the family. The Great Depression hit Appalachia particularly hard, and the Whitlocks, already struggling with their genetic burden, faced economic catastrophe. Several families left the Hollow during this period, migrating north to find work in Ohio and Michigan factories. This diaspora meant that Whitlock deaths began occurring outside Kentucky, scattered across the industrial Midwest. These dispersed deaths actually helped future research. Because affected individuals were now seeking medical care in different locations, modern hospitals in cities with better resources, more complete medical records were created. X-rays of affected brains showed abnormalities. Autopsies revealed consistent patterns of tissue degeneration in specific brain regions. In 1945, a neurologist in Cleveland named Dr. Robert Chen encountered a Whitlock descendant whose symptoms matched descriptions in medical literature he had read years earlier. Dr. Chen began corresponding with other physicians who had treated Whitlocks, slowly assembling a more complete medical picture. World War II had accelerated medical research dramatically. New techniques, new technologies, and new understanding were emerging. In 1951, Dr. Chen published a comprehensive paper on what he called Whitlock syndrome, a hereditary neurodegenerative disorder characterized by adult-onset progressive neurological decline. More importantly, Dr. Chen's research attracted the attention of genetic researchers at the National Institutes of Health. In 1953, James Watson and Francis Crick published their discovery of DNA's double helix structure. Suddenly, hereditary diseases weren't mysterious curses. They were coding errors that could potentially be understood at the molecular level. In 1955, a team of geneticists contacted the Whitlock family. They wanted to conduct a comprehensive genetic study. They wanted blood samples from all living family members, affected and unaffected. They wanted access to the tissue samples Dr. Hartwell had collected 26 years earlier. They wanted Samuel's chronicles, medical records, everything. The family, by now spanning 4 generations from Thomas the founder, held a meeting. Nearly 60 Whitlocks gathered at a church in Harlan, some from the Hollow, others who had traveled from Ohio, Michigan, Indiana. They discussed whether to participate. The arguments went late into the night. Some felt that allowing outsiders to study them was a betrayal of privacy, an exploitation of suffering. Others argued that if there was any chance their cooperation might lead to understanding, might save future generations, they had a moral obligation to help. Finally, a woman named Martha Whitlock stood. Martha was 78 years old. She had been born in the Hollow in 1877. She had watched her father die of the curse. She had buried 3 of her own children to it. She had lived through nearly 80 years of inexplicable loss. "I vote we help them," she said. "Not for us. We're old. Most of us who are going to die from this already have. But my grandchildren are young. My great-grandchildren are being born. If there's even a chance that knowing what this is might help them someday, we do it." The family voted to participate. The genetic study took 3 years and involved researchers from 5 institutions. They analyzed blood samples, tissue samples, and the detailed family histories Samuel Whitlock had compiled. They constructed an exhaustive family tree going back to Thomas Whitlock in 1847. In 1958, they published their findings. The Whitlock family carried a mutation in a gene that produced a protein critical for neuronal health. The mutation caused this protein to fold incorrectly. These misfolded proteins accumulated in brain cells over time, eventually killing the neurons. The disease was indeed dominant. 1 copy of the mutated gene was sufficient to cause illness. The age of onset varied because other genetic and environmental factors influenced how quickly the misfolded proteins accumulated. The researchers estimated that the original mutation had occurred in Thomas Whitlock himself, or possibly in one of his parents. From that single genetic error, carried forward through 7 decades and 3 generations, the family's suffering had flowed. There was no cure. There was no treatment. But there was knowledge, and knowledge brought power. Armed with an understanding of the genetic mechanism, the family could make informed decisions. Young Whitlocks could be tested to see if they carried the mutation. Those who tested positive knew to watch for symptoms and could make choices about having children. Those who tested negative could marry and have families with the certainty that they wouldn't pass the curse to the next generation. The gene could be traced through family lines. Cousins could know whether their branch of the family tree carried the mutation or had been spared. Knowledge replaced mystery. The last documented death from Whitlock syndrome occurred in 1956, just before the genetic study was completed. A man named James Whitlock, named for his great-great-grandfather who had died in 1893, succumbed to the disease at age 42. He was the 73rd confirmed victim across 3 generations. 73 deaths from a single genetic mutation in one family over 67 years. It remains one of the most devastating hereditary disease clusters in American medical history. But the curse ended there. With genetic testing available, younger generations could make informed choices. Some carriers chose not to have children. Others used emerging reproductive technologies to ensure they didn't pass the mutation forward. The family line continued, but the systematic deaths stopped. Today, descendants of the Whitlock family live across the United States. Most are unaffected, carrying either no copies of the mutation or, in rare cases, living with the knowledge that they carry one copy but choosing to break the chain of transmission. The hollow where the family lived for over a century is largely abandoned now, reclaimed by forest. A few ruined cabins remain, their stones slowly sinking into the earth. The cemetery on the hillside, where 73 graves mark the curse's toll, is maintained by a family foundation. Every year on the first Sunday in June, descendants gather there to remember those who died before science could offer answers. The story of the Whitlock family raises profound questions about heredity, fate, and the nature of curses. For 2 generations, the family believed they were victims of something supernatural, a curse, perhaps, or divine punishment for some forgotten sin. They lived with the terror of randomness, never knowing which child would sicken, which parent would suddenly complain of headaches that signaled death. They watched their family shrink with each generation, their genetic diversity narrowing as branches of the family tree were pruned by early death. Yet the curse was never supernatural. It was molecular. A tiny error in the genetic code, perhaps just a single nucleotide changed in one individual over a century ago, set off a cascade of suffering that lasted decades. This error was copied and passed forward with biological precision, as inevitable as the inheritance of eye color or height. There's something existentially troubling about this. If the curse had been truly supernatural, breaking it might have been possible through prayer, ritual, or moral reformation. But a genetic curse can't be reasoned with or appeased. It simply is, written into the blueprint of life itself. The Whitlock family's experience also highlights the devastating impact of medical ignorance. For 50 years, from 1889 to 1939, the family suffered without understanding. Doctors could only offer vague diagnoses and helpless sympathy. Families made decisions, where to live, whether to marry, whether to have children, based on fear and superstition rather than knowledge. Dr. Margaret Hartwell's work in 1929 began to change this, but even she could only offer understanding, not solutions. The real transformation came only when genetics emerged as a field in the 1950s. Suddenly, the curse had a name, a mechanism, a mode of transmission that could be traced and predicted. But knowledge brought its own burden. Once genetic testing became available, Whitlock descendants faced difficult choices. Would you want to know if you carried the gene? If you tested positive, would you tell potential partners? Would you have children? Would you test them? These questions touch on deep ethical territory that medicine and society are still navigating. The Whitlock family confronted these issues decades before they became mainstream concerns. In many ways, they were pioneers not just of genetic disease documentation, but of genetic decision-making. Some ethicists have studied the Whitlock case as an example of how families cope with hereditary disease knowledge. Interviews with descendants reveal a range of responses. Some expressed relief at finally understanding their family history. Others described the burden of knowing they carried a deadly gene, even if they chose not to pass it on. Many expressed complicated grief, mourning not just those who died, but the potential children they chose not to have to end the curse. One descendant, interviewed in 1987, put it this way: "My grandmother lost 3 children to this disease before anyone knew what it was. She died thinking God was punishing her for something. I carry the same gene she did, but I have choices she never had. I can end this. By not having children, I can stop this line of suffering. Is that a gift or a loss? Some days I don't know." The story of the Whitlock family remains a disturbing reminder that sometimes the most terrible curses are written not in magic but in biology, that we carry within our very cells the potential for our own destruction, passed down from ancestors who had no choice in the matter. But questions remain. The original mutation likely occurred in Thomas Whitlock or one of his parents. Why? Genetic mutations happen randomly, but certain factors increase their likelihood. Exposure to toxins, radiation, certain chemicals. Did Thomas's parents work in conditions that made mutations more likely? Did Thomas himself experience some exposure that altered his genetic code? We'll never know. The cause of the original mutation remains lost to history, and there are other mysteries. Not all carriers of the gene developed symptoms. Some lived into their 60s and 70s with no signs of the disease. The researchers in 1958 speculated about modifier genes or environmental factors that might influence whether the mutation expressed itself, but they couldn't identify specific mechanisms. Even today, with far more advanced genetic knowledge, the variable expressivity of the disease remains partially unexplained. One researcher involved in the 1950s study kept working on the case for decades afterward. Dr. Chen, who had first coined the term Whitlock syndrome in 1951, continued to correspond with family members and follow up on new developments in neurodegenerative disease research. In his personal papers, donated to a medical archive after his death in 1994, he wrote, "The Whitlock family taught me that every disease has a story, and every story has a human dimension that pure science can't capture. We can identify the gene, trace the mutation, predict the outcomes, but we can't fully understand what it meant to live under that shadow for 3 generations." To this day, the abandoned hollow in Harlan County where the Whitlock family lived for over a century holds a strange power. Locals occasionally visit the old cemetery, and some report an overwhelming sense of sadness that permeates the place. Not supernatural, perhaps, but the accumulated weight of so much grief concentrated in one small valley. The ruins of the cabins are still there, slowly collapsing into the earth. Stone foundations mark where families lived and loved and watched their children die of an invisible killer written into their DNA. On quiet mornings, when mist rises from the creek and hangs between the ridges, it's easy to imagine the sounds that once filled that hollow. Children playing, women calling them home for dinner, the ring of an axe on wood, and beneath those normal sounds, the terrible silence that must have fallen when another family member took to their bed with those first fatal headaches. The Whitlock family story has become part of medical history, cited in genetics textbooks and studied by researchers working on neurodegenerative diseases. The tissue samples collected by Dr. Hartwell in 1929 and the blood samples collected in the 1950s are still preserved in research archives, still occasionally analyzed with new techniques as technology advances. In 2015, researchers used modern genomic sequencing on those old samples to identify the precise mutation responsible for the disease, a single nucleotide substitution that changed one amino acid in a critical protein. That tiny change, invisible, microscopic, molecular, killed 73 people. What do we make of a story like this? It's not a typical true crime tale with villains and victims in the usual sense. There's no one to blame, no justice to seek. The Whitlock family's curse came from within, written into their very cells by chance or circumstance we can't identify. Yet in their suffering and in their eventual understanding, there's something profoundly human. The family endured for 3 generations without answers, burying their dead, mourning their losses, and continuing anyway because that's what humans do. We endure. We persist even when persistence seems pointless, even when the universe appears indifferent to our suffering, and when answers finally came, the family made them matter. They participated in research. They documented their history. They made difficult choices to ensure that the 4th generation wouldn't face what the first 3 had endured. That's a different kind of heroism. Not dramatic or celebrated, but real and costly. The Whitlock family's story also reminds us how much has changed in medicine in just a few generations. A disease that was mysterious and incurable in 1889 was understood at the genetic level by 1958. People who would have died without diagnosis in their grandparents' era can now be tested, monitored, and counseled. The curse that seemed eternal proved to be molecular and eventually manageable, but it also reminds us how much hasn't changed. We still face diseases we don't fully understand. Families still watch loved ones decline from conditions medicine can't cure. We've gained knowledge and tools, but we haven't eliminated suffering. The Whitlock family's experience from 1889 to 1956 isn't ancient history. It's a preview of struggles many families still face today with other genetic diseases. If this journey through 3 generations of genetic tragedy has moved you, if you find yourself contemplating the fragile nature of heredity and the power of scientific understanding to transform curses into manageable facts, then consider subscribing to this channel. There are many more stories waiting to be told. Stories of families who endured the unendurable, mysteries that took generations to solve, and human resilience in the face of inexplicable suffering. Leave a like if this account provoked reflections that go beyond mere entertainment. If it made you think about your own family history and what invisible legacies might be written in your genes. And comment sharing your thoughts on a question the Whitlock family faced. If you could know your genetic fate, if you could learn what diseases you carry in your DNA, would you want to? What would you do with that knowledge? Until next time, remember that history's darkest chapters often teach the most profound lessons. The Whitlock family's curse was real, devastating, and ultimately understandable. Their story ended not with miracle or mystery, but with science and sacrifice, a fitting testament to human resilience in the face of biological fate. But our story doesn't end with the last death in 1956, or even with the genetic study that finally named the curse. In many ways, the most complex chapter of the Whitlock saga began precisely when the dying stopped, because the survivors were left with a burden perhaps heavier than death itself, the burden of knowledge. Consider the position of a young Whitlock in 1960, just after genetic testing became available to the family. You're 22 years old. You've grown up hearing stories about the curse, watching older relatives die, attending funerals that seemed to come like clockwork. Now, a doctor sits across from you in a sterile office and says, "We can tell you if you carry the gene. Would you like to know?" What do you say? This wasn't a hypothetical question. It was the reality faced by dozens of Whitlock descendants in the late 1950s and early 1960s. And their answers reveal something profound about human nature, about how we cope with fate, and about what it means to live with inherited doom. Robert Mitchell learned he carried the Whitlock gene on a Tuesday afternoon in October 1961. He was 28 years old, married for 3 years, and his wife Ellen was 2 months pregnant with their first child. The genetic counselor, a young woman named Dr. Patricia Summers, had delivered the news with professional compassion. "Mr. Mitchell, you carry one copy of the mutated gene. This means you have a 50% chance of developing symptoms at some point in your life, and a 50% chance of passing the gene to any children you have." Robert sat in silence for a long moment. Then he asked, "The baby Ellen's carrying. Can you test it?" "Not yet," Dr. Summers replied. "Not safely. Amniocentesis is still experimental, and even if we could sample fetal cells, we don't yet have reliable prenatal genetic tests for this condition, so we won't know until after the baby is born. We won't know until the child is old enough to test, which we typically recommend waiting until they're 18 and can consent for themselves. Or," she paused, choosing her words carefully, "until they develop symptoms. If they're going to." Robert drove home that afternoon in a fog. He had gone to the testing appointment alone, telling Ellen he was attending a work meeting. He had promised her he'd get tested, that they'd face the results together, but at the last moment, he'd decided to go alone. Now he understood why. He needed time to process this alone. When he arrived home, Ellen was in the kitchen, humming while she prepared dinner. She was showing now, her belly slightly rounded with their child. She looked up when he entered, her face bright with that particular glow people describe in expectant mothers. "How was your day?" she asked. Robert opened his mouth to tell her. The words were right there. "I carry the gene. Our baby might carry it too. Everything we thought about our future might be wrong." Instead, he heard himself say, "Fine, busy. How are you feeling?" For the next 6 months, Robert Mitchell carried his secret alone. He attended prenatal appointments, helped Ellen set up the nursery, picked out names. The entire time, he was calculating probabilities in his head. 50% chance he'd develop symptoms. If he did, he'd likely die within a year of onset based on family history. The baby had a 50% chance of inheriting the gene from him, and a 50% chance of developing symptoms if they did inherit it. 25% chance, overall, that his child would die of the Whitlock curse. Those odds haunted him. 1 in 4. Better than 50-50, but still horrifying. He would watch Ellen sleep at night, her hand resting on her belly, and think, "What have I done? What right did I have to pass this on?" Their daughter Rachel was born in April 1962. She was healthy, 7 pounds and 4 ounces, with Robert's dark hair and Ellen's green eyes. When the nurse placed her in Robert's arms for the first time, he felt a wave of love so intense it was almost painful, followed immediately by a wave of guilt equally intense. 3 months after Rachel's birth, Robert finally told Ellen the truth. They were sitting on their back porch one evening after putting Rachel to bed. The summer air was thick and humid, filled with the sound of crickets. Robert had rehearsed this conversation 100 times in his head, but now that the moment had arrived, his carefully prepared words evaporated. "I got tested," he said abruptly. "Last October, before Rachel was born. I carry the gene." Ellen turned to look at him, her expression unreadable. "You've known for almost a year?" "I couldn't tell you." "You were pregnant." "I didn't want to." "You didn't want to what?" "Give me the choice to know." "Give me the chance to prepare." Her voice was rising. "Did you think about what that means for Rachel?" "I think about nothing else," Robert said, and something in his voice must have conveyed the depth of his torment, because Ellen's anger visibly deflated. They sat in silence for a long time. Finally, Ellen spoke. "We can't change it now. Rachel is here. She exists, and we'll love her no matter what happens." "But what if she has it?" Robert's voice broke. "What if she dies young because of me?" Ellen took his hand. "Then we'll have loved her for however long we get. That's all any parent can promise." Over the next 38 years, Robert and Ellen Mitchell lived with uncertainty. They decided not to have more children. They watched Rachel grow, a bright, energetic child who excelled in school, who played soccer and learned piano, who went to college and became a teacher. They watched for symptoms that never came. Rachel Mitchell turned 18 in 1980. Her parents sat her down on her birthday and told her everything: the family history, the genetic curse, the 50% chance she carried the gene that had killed 73 relatives over 3 generations. "Do you want to be tested?" her mother asked. Rachel thought for a long moment. "Not yet," she said finally. "Someday maybe, if I decide to have children. But right now, I'd rather not know. I'd rather just live." And she did. Rachel lived fully and deliberately. She traveled. She pursued passions. She fell in love and married at 28. When she and her husband discussed children, she told him about the gene. Together, they decided to adopt. "I could get tested," Rachel told her parents when she announced the adoption plans. "I could find out if I have the gene. But I realized something: it doesn't matter. Even if I don't have it, I don't want to take the risk of passing it to a biological child. This curse stops with me, one way or another." Robert Mitchell died in 2000, at age 67. He never developed symptoms. He had spent 39 years waiting for headaches that never came, watching for the signs of the disease that would eventually claim him. It never did. He died of a heart attack, sudden and unexpected, while gardening on a Saturday morning. At his funeral, Rachel spoke. "My father lived his entire adult life under a shadow. He carried a gene that might have killed him, and he knew he might have passed it to me. That knowledge weighed on him every day, but he never let it stop him from living, from loving, from being the best father he could be." That's the real lesson of our family story. It's not about the curse. It's about how we choose to live despite it. Rachel Mitchell is 73 years old now, as of 2025. She still hasn't been tested for the gene. She has never developed symptoms. Her adopted children are healthy adults with families of their own. Sometimes she wonders if she carries the mutation somewhere in her DNA, dormant and unexpressed. Mostly, she doesn't think about it. "I decided a long time ago," she told an interviewer in 2018, "that I wasn't going to let a genetic possibility dictate my happiness." Maybe that was denial. Maybe it was courage. Probably it was both. But it was my choice, and I made it. And I'm still here. While families like the Mitchells were wrestling with personal decisions about testing and reproduction, another chapter of the Whitlock story was unfolding in academia. This part of the tale involves a genealogist named Margaret Chen, no relation to Dr. Robert Chen, who had studied the family in the 1940s and 50s, who became obsessed with reconstructing the complete Whitlock family tree. Margaret Chen stumbled upon the Whitlock case in 1973 while researching Appalachian migration patterns for her doctoral dissertation at the University of Kentucky. She was examining census records from Harlan County when she noticed something unusual: an extraordinarily high death rate among individuals with the surname Whitlock between 1890 and 1960, with a particular concentration of deaths among young adults and those in middle age. Intrigued, she began to dig deeper. She spent months in county archives, examining death certificates, probate records, and old newspapers. She discovered Samuel Whitlock's chronicles in the archives of the University of Louisville Medical School, where they had been donated after his death. She tracked down surviving family members and conducted interviews. What emerged from her research was more than just a family tree. It was a comprehensive social history of how a genetic disease shaped an entire community across 3 generations. Margaret's dissertation, published in 1976, entitled Death in the Mountains: The Social Impact of Hereditary Disease in Isolated Appalachian Communities, became a landmark work in medical anthropology. But more importantly, it revealed aspects of the Whitlock story that had been overlooked in the purely medical accounts. For instance, Margaret discovered that the Whitlock curse had profound effects on marriage patterns in Harlan County. Families in the region became reluctant to allow their children to marry Whitlocks, fearing they might carry the deadly gene. This led to increasing isolation of the affected family, which paradoxically may have intensified the genetic concentration of the disease through increased consanguinity. Whitlocks marrying other Whitlocks because few outside the family would have them. She documented how the curse affected the family's economic status. Men who knew they might die young were reluctant to invest in long-term agricultural improvements or business ventures. Families struggled to maintain farms when fathers died suddenly, leaving widows and young children. The community's perception of the Whitlocks as cursed made it difficult for them to secure credit or business partnerships. Margaret also uncovered evidence of profound psychological trauma that rippled through generations. She found diary entries and letters describing anxiety, depression, and what we would now recognize as symptoms of PTSD among family members who had witnessed multiple relatives die of the disease. Children grew up in households shadowed by fear, never sure if they or their siblings would be next. One particularly poignant discovery was a letter written in 1924 by a young Whitlock woman named Catherine to her fiancé, breaking off their engagement. "Dearest William, I cannot in good conscience marry you. My father died of the family illness last year. My brother shows signs of it now. I may carry whatever poison flows in our blood. I will not subject you to watching me die, nor will I risk passing this curse to children we might have. Please understand that I love you, which is precisely why I must let you go. Find someone whose future is not written in such dark ink." Forgive me, Catherine. William did not find someone else. Margaret traced his life through records and discovered that he never married, never had children, and died alone in 1967 at age 74. Catherine, meanwhile, lived to age 82, never developing symptoms, never marrying, spending her life as a schoolteacher in a small Kentucky town. She never knew that she didn't carry the gene, that her sacrifice had been unnecessary. By the time testing became available, she was elderly and saw no point in confirming what her symptom-free life had already suggested. Margaret's research revealed dozens of similar stories, lives shaped and constrained by a genetic possibility that, in many cases, never materialized. Young people who remained single rather than risk passing on the curse. Couples who married but chose not to have children. Individuals who left their communities and changed their names, trying to escape the stigma of the Whitlock bloodline. But Margaret also found stories of remarkable resilience. She documented how the family developed support networks, how they cared for sick members with extraordinary devotion, how they maintained hope even as death claimed relative after relative. She found evidence of dark humor used as a coping mechanism. One family member apparently kept a running joke about Whitlock roulette, the grim game of wondering which child would be spared and which would fall. Victim: Margaret's work attracted attention beyond academic circles. In 1978, she was contacted by a television producer interested in creating a documentary about the Whitlock family. The project, which aired on PBS in 1980 under the title The Bloodline, 3 Generations Under a Genetic Shadow, brought the Whitlock story to national attention. The documentary included interviews with surviving family members, including several who had tested positive for the gene but not yet developed symptoms. One of these interviews became particularly famous, or infamous depending on perspective. The subject was a man named Daniel Whitlock, then 42 years old. He had tested positive for the gene at age 25 and had spent the subsequent 17 years waiting for symptoms that hadn't arrived. The interviewer asked him how he lived with that knowledge. Daniel's response was raw and honest. "Every headache is terror. Every time I forget a word or can't remember where I put my keys, I think, this is it. This is the beginning. I've lived the last 17 years in a state of constant vigilance, constantly monitoring my own body for signs of betrayal. It's exhausting. Some days I wish I'd never gotten tested. Ignorance really might have been bliss. The interviewer pressed. Do you regret knowing? Daniel was quiet for a long moment. I don't know. Knowing meant I didn't have children. I didn't pass this on. That matters. But it also meant I've lived half my life in a waiting room, anticipating death. I'm not sure which is worse, dying of the disease or spending decades afraid you're about to. Daniel Whitlock never did develop symptoms. He died in 2015 at age 77 of complications from diabetes. He spent 35 years carrying the gene that never killed him, 35 years waiting for a death sentence that never came. His story raises uncomfortable questions about genetic testing that remain unresolved today. Is it better to know your genetic risks, even if that knowledge creates psychological burden, or is ignorance sometimes merciful? Different people answer these questions differently, and there's no consensus even among ethicists and genetic counselors. Margaret Chen's research also uncovered something that changed the medical understanding of the Whitlock curse. Not all carriers developed symptoms, and the age of onset varied dramatically among those who did. She created a detailed statistical analysis of the 73 documented deaths. What she found was surprising. While the average age of symptom onset was 34, the range was enormous. The youngest victim had been 12. The oldest had been 58. Some individuals declined rapidly, dying within weeks of first symptoms. Others lingered for over a year, their deterioration slow and progressive. This variability suggested what geneticists call incomplete penetrance. Not everyone who carries a disease-causing mutation will actually develop the disease. It also suggested variable expressivity. Even among those who do develop the disease, severity and age of onset can vary dramatically. Margaret's statistical work caught the attention of researchers at the National Institutes of Health. In 1982, they launched a follow-up study to the 1950s genetic research, specifically investigating why some carriers developed symptoms and others didn't. They recruited Whitlock descendants, both symptomatic and asymptomatic carriers, as well as non-carriers, for a comprehensive genetic and environmental analysis. This study, which continued for over 15 years and involved more than 100 Whitlock descendants, led to several important discoveries. Researchers identified modifier genes, other genetic variations that influenced whether the Whitlock mutation caused disease and how severe it would be. They also found evidence that environmental factors, diet, exposure to certain toxins, even exercise patterns, might influence disease expression. By the mid-1990s, the picture had become more complex and, in some ways, more hopeful. The Whitlock mutation wasn't a simple death sentence. It was a risk factor, influenced by dozens of other genetic and environmental variables. Some carriers would develop symptoms, others wouldn't. And even among those who developed symptoms, new supportive treatments being developed for neurodegenerative diseases offered hope for longer, better quality of life. The Whitlock family's experience became a case study in medical ethics classrooms across the country. Their story raised questions that extended far beyond one family's genetic tragedy. Consider the question of testing children. Should parents who carry the Whitlock gene have their children tested for it? The gene is dominant, meaning children have a 50% chance of inheriting it. Knowing whether a child carries the gene could inform medical monitoring and life planning, but it also brands that child with knowledge of potential future disease, potentially affecting their psychology, their relationships, their sense of self. Medical ethicists debated this intensely throughout the 1980s and 1990s. Some argued that testing children for adult-onset genetic diseases was harmful. Why burden a child with knowledge of a disease that won't manifest, if it ever does, until adulthood? Others argued that foreknowledge allowed for better medical surveillance and earlier intervention if symptoms appeared. The Whitlock family themselves were divided on this question. Some parents tested their children as soon as testing became available. Others refused, determining that their children would make that choice for themselves when they reached adulthood. Still others took a middle path, testing but not revealing results until the child was old enough to understand their meaning. One family's decision became particularly controversial. In 1987, a Whitlock descendant named Sharon tested her 8-year-old son David for the gene. He tested positive. Sharon's reasoning was that knowing would allow her to make informed decisions about his education and activities. Maybe he should pursue experiences earlier in life rather than postponing them, given that he might not have a full lifespan. But David later reported that learning about his genetic status as a child had been traumatic. He described feeling marked for death throughout his adolescence, struggling with depression and anxiety, feeling different from his peers who didn't live under a genetic shadow. When he reached his 20s and still hadn't developed symptoms, the anxiety didn't decrease, it intensified. Every year symptom-free was just another year closer to potential onset. My mother thought she was helping me, David told an interviewer in 2005 when he was 26. She thought knowing would empower me. Instead, it defined me. I wasn't David the person. I was David the carrier. David the walking time bomb. Every choice I made, career, relationships, where to live, was colored by the knowledge that I might not have much time. I'm not sure I would have chosen to know if the choice had been mine. David Whitlock is 46 now, as of 2025. He still hasn't developed symptoms. He's married, has 2 children, both adopted by his choice, and works as a software engineer in Portland, Oregon. He's lived longer symptom-free than many of his ancestors lived at all. But he reports that the anxiety never fully goes away. The sword of Damocles, he calls it, hanging over me constantly. Some days I don't think about it, but it's always there in the background, this knowledge that my brain might betray me at any moment. The question of whether to test minors for adult-onset genetic diseases remains contentious. Most genetic counselors now recommend waiting until the child can participate in the decision, typically age 18 or older, but exceptions are made when knowing genetic status would influence childhood medical care. The Whitlock case is frequently cited in these discussions as an example of how well-intentioned genetic testing can create psychological burden. Another ethical question that emerged from the Whitlock story: disclosure obligations in relationships and reproduction. Say you're a Whitlock descendant who tests positive for the gene. Do you have an obligation to tell romantic partners before getting seriously involved? Before marriage? Before having children? At what point does non-disclosure become deception, or even harm? This question became legally relevant in 1994, when a woman named Jennifer Martin sued her ex-husband, a Whitlock descendant named Thomas, for genetic fraud. Jennifer claimed that Thomas had known he carried the Whitlock gene when they married and conceived children, but he never disclosed this information to her. Their daughter had subsequently tested positive for the gene, giving her a significant risk of developing the disease. Jennifer's lawsuit argued that Thomas's non-disclosure had violated her reproductive autonomy, her right to make informed decisions about whether to have biological children with him. She claimed emotional distress and sought damages for medical monitoring costs for their daughter. The case was ultimately dismissed on technical legal grounds, but it sparked intense debate. Privacy advocates argued that genetic information is personal medical data that individuals have a right to keep private, even from partners. Others countered that knowingly concealing heritable disease risk from a reproductive partner is ethically wrong and potentially should be legally actionable. The Whitlock family themselves were divided. Some felt that Thomas had a moral obligation to disclose his genetic status before marriage and reproduction. Others felt that Jennifer's lawsuit violated Thomas's medical privacy and set a dangerous precedent for genetic discrimination. The case highlighted how genetic knowledge complicates traditional notions of privacy, autonomy, and family. Your genes aren't just yours. They're shared with your children, your siblings, your extended family. A genetic test reveals information not just about you, but about your relatives. When do their interests in that information outweigh your privacy interests? Courts and legislatures have struggled with these questions. The Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act, GINA, passed in 2008, protects Americans from genetic discrimination in employment and health insurance. But it doesn't address family relationships, reproduction, or life insurance. The legal and ethical framework for genetic information remains incomplete. The Whitlock family story has become a teaching case in law schools, medical schools, and bioethics programs precisely because it illustrates these complexities so vividly. It's not just a historical curiosity. It's a preview of dilemmas that more and more families face as genetic testing becomes routine. By 2025, an estimated 30 million Americans have undergone some form of genetic testing through direct-to-consumer services like 23andMe, through medical genetic screening, or through participation in research studies. Many have discovered that they carry variants associated with increased disease risk. They face the same questions the Whitlock descendants faced decades earlier. What do you do with that knowledge? Who do you tell? How do you live with uncertainty? The tissue samples and blood samples collected from the Whitlock family between 1929 and the 1990s became one of the most valuable research resources in the study of neurodegenerative disease. As genetic technology advanced, researchers returned to these samples again and again, each time with new tools that revealed new insights. In the 1990s, advanced DNA sequencing techniques identified the precise mutation responsible for the disease, a single nucleotide change in a gene that produces a protein critical for neuronal function. In the 2000s, researchers used the Whitlock samples to study how the mutated protein misfolds and how these misfolded proteins aggregate in brain cells, eventually killing them. This research contributed to broader understanding of protein-folding diseases, a category that includes Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, and several other devastating conditions. In 2012, researchers announced a breakthrough. Using cells derived from Whitlock family blood samples, they had successfully created a cellular model of the disease in the laboratory. They could now watch in real time how the mutated protein caused cells to die. More importantly, they could test potential treatments. This research led to clinical trials of several experimental therapies designed to either correct the protein misfolding or clear the misfolded proteins from cells before they cause damage. While none of these treatments has yet proven curative, some show promise in slowing disease progression. One of the most hopeful developments came in 2019, when researchers used CRISPR gene editing technology to correct the Whitlock mutation in human cells grown in culture. This proof-of-concept study suggested that, someday, it might be possible to actually cure the disease by editing the mutated gene. A Whitlock descendant named Emily Robertson, herself a carrier of the gene, worked on that research team. In an interview after the study's publication, she reflected on the experience. My great-great-great-grandfather, Thomas Whitlock, probably had no idea that a mutation in his DNA would kill 73 of his descendants over the next century. He probably couldn't have conceived of DNA at all. The science didn't exist yet. But now, we're on the verge of being able to fix that mutation, to literally rewrite the genetic code that caused so much suffering. I'm doing this research not just as a scientist, but as a family member. This is personal. Every breakthrough brings us closer to the day when no one else has to die of this disease. Emily is 42 now, the same age Daniel Whitlock was when he was interviewed for the 1980 documentary, waiting anxiously for symptoms. But Emily faces a different future. If she develops symptoms, experimental treatments exist that might slow progression. And if gene editing therapies are approved for human use, she might even be cured. The Whitlock family's contribution to science extends beyond their own disease. Research on the Whitlock mutation has contributed to understanding of neurodegenerative diseases more broadly. The mechanisms by which the Whitlock protein misfolds and causes cell death are similar to mechanisms in other diseases affecting millions of people worldwide. In 2020, a research paper published in the journal Nature acknowledged the Whitlock family by name, thanking them for their extraordinary contribution to science through participation in research. Spanning 7 decades, the paper's findings about protein aggregation mechanisms had implications for Alzheimer's disease, which affects nearly 6 million Americans. The family's legacy, then, extends far beyond their own bloodline. Their suffering, meticulously documented and studied, has advanced human knowledge in ways that may eventually help millions of people facing similar diseases. Today, in 2025, an estimated 500 people carry some Whitlock ancestry, spread across the United States and beyond. Most have never developed symptoms. Many have been tested and know their genetic status. Others have chosen to remain in uncertainty. The family holds a reunion every 5 years in Harlan County, Kentucky. The most recent gathering in summer 2024 drew about 70 people, descendants, researchers who have studied the family, genetic counselors, and even a few documentary filmmakers working on a follow-up to the 1980 PBS special. The reunions have a strange atmosphere. Part family celebration, part medical conference, part memorial service. There are children playing, families catching up, the normal rhythms of a family gathering. But there are also somber moments. Visits to the cemetery where 73 victims are buried. Discussions of who has been recently tested and what the results were. Updates on the latest research developments. One attendee at the 2024 reunion was Sophia Whitlock Chen, age 29, great-great-great-great-granddaughter of Thomas Whitlock. Sophia represents a new generation's approach to the family legacy. She was tested at age 21 and learned she carries the mutation. Rather than living in fear or making dramatic life changes, she approaches her genetic status pragmatically. She sees a neurologist annually for monitoring. She participates in research studies. She's enrolled in a clinical trial testing a preventive therapy for mutation carriers who haven't yet developed symptoms. "I know I have the gene," Sophia told an interviewer at the reunion. "I know there's a chance I'll develop symptoms someday. But there's also a good chance I won't, and even if I do, treatment options exist now that didn't exist when my ancestors were dying. I'm not going to waste my life being afraid of a possibility. I'm going to live fully and take reasonable precautions." That's all anyone can do, really, genetic mutation or not. Sophia is engaged to be married. She and her fiancé plan to have children using IVF with pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, a technique that allows embryos to be tested for the mutation before implantation. Only embryos without the mutation will be transferred. This means her children will be Whitlock descendants without the Whitlock curse. "The curse ends with my generation," Sophia says matter-of-factly. "Not because we're dying out, but because we have the technology to stop passing it on." That feels like the right ending to this story. Not tragedy, but choice. We get to choose a different future. Not all Whitlock descendants agree with Sophia's approach. Some view pre-implantation genetic diagnosis as a form of eugenics, objecting to the selection of embryos based on genetic traits. Others worry about the expense. PGD IVF can cost tens of thousands of dollars, placing it out of reach for many families. There are also philosophical questions. If you can select against the Whitlock mutation, what other traits might be selected for or against? Where do we draw the line? The technology that allows Sophia to have children without the curse could also be used to select for height, intelligence, physical appearance. The Whitlock family's ethical dilemmas continue to evolve with the technology. But for many in the family, the availability of options, testing, monitoring, clinical trials, reproductive technology, represents a kind of liberation. They're no longer helpless victims of genetic fate. They have choices, agency, hope. The 2024 reunion ended with a ceremony at the cemetery. 73 names were read aloud. Every person who had died of the Whitlock curse between 1889 and 1956. As each name was spoken, a family member placed a white rose on the collective grave marker erected in 2000. After the names were read, Sophia spoke briefly. "We remember these 73 people not just for how they died, but for how they lived. They loved and worked and raised families and endured impossible grief. They participated in research that has helped not just our family, but potentially millions of others. Their legacy isn't just suffering, it's also knowledge, resilience, and hope. We honor them by living well, by making the most of the opportunities they never had, by being the generation that ends this curse not through death, but through science." The Whitlock family story forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about heredity, fate, and human existence. We like to think we control our destinies. We make choices, set goals, work toward futures we imagine. But the Whitlock curse reveals the limits of that control. A single molecular error, occurring in one person perhaps 180 years ago, rippled forward through time, killing and traumatizing dozens of people who had no say in their genetic inheritance. Yet within that determinism, there were choices. Choices about whether to get tested, choices about whether to have children, choices about how to live with uncertainty, choices about whether to participate in research. The Whitlock descendants weren't passive victims. They were active agents navigating an impossibly difficult situation. There's something profoundly humanizing about this. The story resists simple narratives of either helpless victimhood or heroic triumph. It's messier than that, more ambiguous. People made different choices, and there's no single right answer to the dilemmas they faced. Consider two cousins, both carriers of the gene, who made opposite choices about reproduction. One had biological children, accepting the 50% risk, reasoning that life is precious even if it's potentially shortened. The other chose not to reproduce, unwilling to possibly pass on suffering. Both choices are defensible. Both reflect deeply held values about responsibility, risk, and the meaning of life. The Whitlock story also challenges our cultural mythology about genetic diseases. We tend to think of them as rare, affecting other people, tragic but distant. In reality, everyone carries genetic variants that increase risk for various diseases. The Whitlock mutation was unusual in its severity and penetrance, but not in its existence. We're all carriers of something. As genetic testing becomes routine, more people will face Whitlock-style dilemmas. Already, millions of people have learned through 23andMe or similar services that they carry variants associated with increased risk for Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, various cancers, heart disease, and countless other conditions. These variants usually convey smaller risks than the Whitlock mutation, but they still raise questions. What do you do with that knowledge? How do you live with statistical risk? The Whitlock family pioneered approaches to these questions. Their experiences, the successes and failures, the wise choices and the regrettable ones, offer guidance for those facing similar situations. Some lessons from the Whitlock story. Knowledge is powerful, but not always comfortable. Genetic testing provides information that can guide medical care and life planning, but it also creates psychological burden. There's no universal answer to whether testing is worth it. It depends on individual circumstances and values. Uncertainty is part of the human condition. Even with perfect genetic knowledge, we can't predict the future with certainty. Variable penetrance and expressivity mean that carriers might never develop symptoms, while non-carriers might face entirely different health challenges. The Whitlock curse teaches us to live with uncertainty rather than being paralyzed by it. Suffering can have meaning without being romanticized. The Whitlock family's pain was real and shouldn't be,